"Grandma, don't take the pills tonight." Those were the first words my granddaughter had spoken in 3 years, and they came out so softly I almost thought I imagined them. But the way her small fingers clutched my sleeve told me I hadn't, and in that moment, standing in the quiet hallway of my own home, I felt something shift inside me, something cold and sharp that didn't belong to grief or age but to instinct, the kind that whispers when something is deeply, terribly wrong. And I slowly lowered the pill bottle in my hand without taking my eyes off her face, because Lily had been declared mute by doctors, by specialists, by my own daughter-in-law who insisted it was a condition we had to accept. And yet here she was, looking up at me with wide, frightened eyes, her lips trembling as if she had already said too much, and before I could ask her anything else, before I could even process the weight of what had just happened, the front door clicked open and her entire body stiffened like a string pulled tight, and just as quickly as her voice had appeared, it vanished, replaced by that familiar silence she had lived in for years, her gaze dropping to the floor as if she had never spoken at all. And when Olivia's voice carried in from the entryway, light and cheerful, asking if everything was all right, I felt Lily's grip tighten once more before she gently let go and stepped back, retreating into that quiet version of herself everyone believed was real. And I stood there for a second longer than I should have, holding that pill bottle like it suddenly weighed more than it had just moments ago, because I knew, with a clarity that settled deep in my chest, that nothing about what had just happened was normal. And yet I forced myself to smile when Olivia walked in, her perfectly composed expression scanning the room before landing on me, and she asked again if I had taken my evening medication, her tone sweet in a way that would have sounded caring to anyone else, but now it felt rehearsed, like a line she had practiced too many times, and I nodded slowly, slipping the bottle into my cardigan pocket as if I had already taken them, because something in me told me not to give anything away, not yet, not until I understood what Lily had tried so hard to tell me. And the rest of that evening unfolded the way so many others had over the past few months, quiet, controlled, with Olivia moving through the kitchen like everything was exactly as it should be, Daniel sitting at the table scrolling through his phone, barely looking up when I spoke, and Lily seated in the corner with her coloring book, silent as always, except now I knew that silence wasn't what it seemed, and every small detail I had ignored before began to feel different, sharper, like pieces of a picture I had never thought to question until now. The way Olivia insisted on managing my medications ever since I moved in after my fall last winter, the way Daniel always agreed with her without hesitation, the way my routines had slowly become theirs, not mine, and I told myself I was overthinking, that I was tired, that grief and age had a way of making everything feel heavier than it was. But when I went to the kitchen later that night and poured myself a glass of water, I caught my reflection in the dark window above the sink and barely recognized the woman staring back at me, because she didn't look confused or forgetful or fragile the way everyone had been suggesting lately. She looked alert, watchful, like someone who had just realized she had been missing something important, and I reached into my pocket, pulled out the pills, and held them in my palm, studying them under the dim kitchen light, small, ordinary, exactly the kind I had been taking for months without question. And yet now I hesitated, my fingers closing slowly around them as Lily's voice echoed in my mind, soft but urgent, and I didn't take them, not that night. Instead I turned off the light, walked back to my room, and sat on the edge of my bed listening to the quiet hum of the house, the faint sounds of Olivia moving downstairs, the distant murmur of Daniel's voice, and for the first time since I had moved in with my son and his wife, I felt like I was not just living in their home, but watching it, as if I had stepped outside the version of reality they had been showing me and into something else entirely, something that had been there all along, waiting for me to notice. And I lay down slowly, staring at the ceiling, my heart beating just a little faster than usual, not from fear exactly, but from the growing certainty that Lily hadn't just spoken by accident, and whatever had made her break that silence was something I needed to understand before it was too late. The next morning, I woke before the sun had fully risen, which was not unusual for me these days, but what felt different was the clarity in my mind, as if something had quietly settled into place overnight, and for a moment I lay still in bed, listening to the soft hum of the house around me, trying to recall every detail from the night before, every word Lily had spoken, every look she had given me. And the more I replayed it, the more certain I became that it had not been a dream, because dreams do not leave behind that kind of lingering unease, that quiet certainty that something has shifted in a way you cannot undo. And when I finally sat up and reached for my glasses, my hand paused halfway, because for the first time in months I did not feel foggy or disoriented the way I usually did in the mornings. There was no heaviness pressing down on my thoughts, no slow struggle to gather myself. And I realized then that I had not taken the pills the night before, and that realization stayed with me as I made my way downstairs, each step measured, careful, as if I were walking through a space that looked familiar but no longer felt the same. And when I reached the kitchen, Olivia was already there, standing by the counter with a cup of coffee in her hand, her posture relaxed but her eyes alert in a way that immediately caught my attention, and she smiled when she saw me, that same warm, practiced smile that had always made me feel both welcomed and slightly observed at the same time. And she asked how I was feeling, whether I had slept well, whether the medication was helping, and I answered her calmly, matching her tone, telling her I felt fine, maybe even a little better, which seemed to please her more than it should have, because she nodded quickly, almost too quickly, and turned back to the stove as if she had been waiting for that exact answer. And I watched her for a moment longer than necessary, noticing the way she moved, precise, controlled, every gesture deliberate. And then Daniel walked in, his tie slightly crooked, his attention already divided between his phone and whatever schedule he had planned for the day. And he greeted me with a brief smile, asked if I needed anything, and before I could respond, he was already distracted again. And I felt that familiar distance between us. But this time I did not push it away or excuse it. I simply observed it. The way he avoided looking at me for more than a second. The way his voice carried a politeness that felt more like obligation than affection. And as we sat down for breakfast, Olivia placed a small dish next to my plate. The same pills I had been taking every morning, arranged neatly beside a glass of water. And I felt my chest tighten just slightly, not with panic, but with awareness. And I glanced toward the corner of the room where Lily sat at the table with her cereal, her head lowered, her movements quiet and careful. But when our eyes met for the briefest second, something passed between us, something that did not need words to be understood, and I looked back at the pills, then at Olivia, who was watching me now with a softness that felt just a little too focused, and I smiled, picked up the glass of water, and lifted it to my lips while keeping the pills hidden in my palm, and in one smooth motion, I pretended to swallow them, tilting my head back just enough to make it convincing. And when I set the glass down, Olivia's shoulders relaxed almost imperceptibly, as if she had been holding her breath, and Daniel barely noticed, already standing up and checking the time, saying he would be late if he did not leave soon, and within minutes, the two of them were moving through their usual routine, gathering keys, exchanging quick words, and then they were gone, the front door closing behind them with a finality that seemed louder than usual, and the house fell into a silence that felt different from before, not empty, but waiting, and I remained seated for a moment. Longer, listening, making sure the sound of their car had faded completely before I slowly opened my hand and looked down at the pills resting in my palm, untouched, and I set them gently on the table, my fingers lingering there as I took a breath and turned toward Lily, who was still sitting quietly, her spoon resting in her bowl, her eyes fixed on me now without hesitation, and I spoke softly, asking her if she wanted to come sit with me, keeping my voice calm, steady, giving her space rather than pressing, and for a second she did not move, as if she were weighing something invisible, and then she slid off her chair and walked toward me, her steps slow but certain, and when she reached my side, she looked up at me with that same fear I had seen the night before. But this time there was something else beneath it, something like resolve, and I lowered my voice even further, asking her gently why she had told me not to take the pills. And for a moment she hesitated, her small hands twisting together, her eyes flicking toward the door as if she expected it to open at any second. And then she leaned in just enough for her words to reach only me, her voice barely more than a whisper, and she said, "Because mommy changes them when you are not looking." And the room seemed to still around us, the quiet stretching out in a way that made every second feel heavier than the last, and I did not react the way I might have before. I did not gasp or question or try to make sense of it out loud. Instead, I simply nodded slowly, as if I had been expecting to hear something like this, and I placed my hand gently over hers, steadying both of us in that moment. Because whatever was happening in this house, whatever had been happening right in front of me for longer than I realized, I understood now that I could not afford to ignore it any longer, and I also understood something else, something that settled deep within me with a quiet certainty, that from this point on, I would not be the same person they believed I was. For the rest of that morning, I moved through the house the same way I always had, slowly, carefully, as if nothing had changed. But inside me, everything had shifted into place with a kind of quiet precision I had not felt in years. And while Lily returned to her chair and picked up her spoon again, slipping back into that silence she had worn like a shield, I remained at the table just a moment longer, my hand still resting lightly over the pills I had not taken, and I let her words settle, not rushing to question them, not forcing her to say more than she already had, because something told me that pushing too hard might make her retreat again, and I needed her trust more than I needed immediate answers. So instead I stood up, carried my dishes to the sink, and began to rinse them as I always did, the sound of running water filling the space between us while my mind worked quietly through what she had told me. And I repeated her words in my head, not changing them, not softening them, just holding on to them exactly as she had said them, because children do not speak like that unless they have seen something clearly enough to understand it in their own way. And I turned off the faucet, dried my hands, and glanced back at her, noticing the way she kept her eyes lowered even when she knew I was looking, as if she had already learned that being seen could be dangerous. And that realization sat heavily with me, but I did not let it show. Instead, I walked over and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, telling her she had done nothing wrong, that she was safe with me, and she nodded slightly without speaking, her small body relaxing just a fraction under my touch. And that was enough for now, more than enough, because I understood that whatever had been happening in this house had not only affected me, it had shaped her silence, her fear, her careful way of existing in a space that should have felt like home. And as the morning passed, I made sure to keep everything as normal as possible. I folded laundry, I watered the plants by the window, I even turned on the television for a while, just to let the familiar background noise fill the rooms, but all the while I was watching, not in an obvious way, not with suspicion written across my face, but with a quiet attention that took in every detail I had once overlooked, the placement of objects, the timing of routines, the way certain things seemed to be arranged just so. And when it came time for my afternoon medication, I made a point of preparing it myself, moving slowly enough that if anyone had been watching, it would have appeared exactly the same as before. But instead of taking the pills, I set them aside, choosing to skip them entirely for the day, and I paid close attention to how I felt as the hours went by, expecting perhaps to feel worse, weaker, less stable the way I had been told would happen if I missed a dose. But the opposite occurred. The fog that had been lingering at the edges of my thoughts seemed to lift further, my movements felt steadier, my mind clearer, and by late afternoon, I found myself standing in the living room with a sense of awareness I had not experienced in months, and that was when the second realization settled in, just as quietly, but far more firmly than the first, that whatever I had been taking was not helping me the way I had been led to believe, and I did not rush to conclusions. I did not allow myself to leap ahead without evidence. But I could no longer ignore the pattern forming in front of me, and when Daniel and Olivia returned home that evening, I greeted them the same way I always did, with a calm smile, asking about their day, listening as Olivia described errands and appointments with her usual polished ease, and I watched Daniel as he responded, noticing again the way he seemed to defer to her in small, almost invisible ways, the way his answers aligned with hers without question, and I felt something shift in my understanding of him as well, not yet judgment, not yet accusation, but a growing awareness that he was either unaware of what was happening or choosing not to see it. And as dinner was prepared and served, I remained fully present, engaging just enough to appear normal, while keeping a careful distance internally. And when Olivia once again placed my evening pills beside my plate, her eyes lingering on me just a fraction longer than necessary, I smiled and thanked her, picking them up with the same steady motion I had practiced that morning. And as I lifted the glass of water, I caught Lily watching me from across the table, her expression tight with silent concern, and I gave her the smallest nod, so subtle that no one else would notice, but enough for her to understand, and I pretended once more, swallowing nothing, playing the role they expected of me, because I understood now that whatever truth was unfolding here would not reveal itself through confrontation. It would require patience, observation, and timing. And later that night, after the house had quieted again and I was alone in my room, I sat by the window with the pill bottle in my hand, turning it slowly as I examined the label, the dosage, the instructions, everything that had once seemed routine and unquestionable. And I realized that for months, perhaps longer, I had been placing my trust in something I had never truly verified, relying on the assumption that those closest to me had my best interests at heart, and that assumption, more than anything else, was what had made me vulnerable. And as I set the bottle down on my nightstand, I made a decision that felt both simple and profound, that from this point forward, I would not take anything at face value, not the medication, not the explanations, not even the roles each person in this house had been playing, because Lily had broken her silence for a reason, and whatever that reason was, it had given me something I had not realized I was missing until now, a clear starting point. And as I turned off the light and lay back in bed, staring into the darkness, I understood that the version of me they had grown accustomed to, the one who accepted, who trusted, who did not question, was no longer the person they would be dealing with, and they had no idea yet that everything was about to change. The next day began the same way as the last, quiet and ordinary on the surface, but underneath that calm routine, something had settled into me with a quiet determination that I could not ignore. And as I stood in front of the bathroom mirror brushing my hair, I studied my own reflection more carefully than I had in a long time, noticing not just the lines of age or the silver in my hair, but the clarity in my eyes, the steadiness that had returned since I stopped taking those pills. And I thought back to the past few months, to the slow way I had been changing, how I had grown forgetful, tired, dependent, how I had accepted that version of myself without questioning it because it had been explained to me so gently, so reasonably, and now, standing there with my mind clear and my body stronger than it had felt in weeks, I began to piece together those changes not as natural decline, but as something influenced, something guided, and I set my brush down slowly, letting that thought settle without rushing to conclusions, because I knew now that understanding required patience. And when I stepped into the hallway, I could already hear Olivia downstairs, moving through the kitchen with her usual efficiency, and I made my way down carefully, keeping my movements steady and familiar, because if there was one thing I understood clearly at this point, it was that I needed to remain exactly as they expected me to be, at least for now. And when I entered the kitchen, Olivia greeted me with the same warm tone, asking how I was feeling, whether I had slept well, and I answered her the same way I had the day before, calm, agreeable, giving her nothing to question, and she nodded, satisfied, before placing my breakfast on the table along with the small dish of pills, arranged neatly as always, and I sat down, noticing how naturally the routine played out, how easily I could have continued living within it without ever seeing what lay beneath. And as I picked up the pills, I glanced briefly toward Lily, who was sitting quietly with her cereal, her posture small, her presence careful, but her eyes met mine for just a second, and that was enough to remind me why I could not let this continue. And once again I pretended, lifting the glass, tilting my head back, allowing the illusion to remain intact, and Olivia watched just long enough to be certain before turning away, and Daniel barely looked up at all, and that told me something as well, something about where his attention truly lay. And after they left for the day, I did not wait. This time, I moved with purpose, not in a hurried way, but with quiet intention, going first to the cabinet where the medications were kept, opening it slowly, taking in everything inside, the arrangement, the labels, the small details that had once seemed insignificant, and I reached for the pill bottle and compared it to the one on the table, noting the subtle differences in color, in shape, in markings, differences that would not stand out unless you were specifically looking for them, and I felt a calm settle over me as I realized that this was not carelessness. This was deliberate, careful, designed not to be noticed, and I closed the cabinet gently, placing everything back exactly as I had found it, because I understood now that any sign of suspicion from me could change whatever they were doing, and I needed them to believe nothing had changed. And the rest of the morning I spent observing more closely than ever before, retracing routines, noticing how often Olivia handled the medications, how frequently she checked on me, how easily she framed everything as concern, and each observation added another small piece to a picture that was becoming clearer with every passing hour. And by the time afternoon arrived, I knew what I needed to do next, not to confront, not yet, but to verify, to confirm beyond doubt what I was beginning to understand. And I picked up my phone and stepped outside onto the back porch, the cool air steadying me as I dialed a number I had not called in years, the office of a pharmacist who had once helped my late husband with his prescriptions, someone I trusted, someone who would not dismiss my questions as confusion or forgetfulness. And when he answered, I kept my voice calm, explaining that I had some concerns about a medication I had been taking, asking if he could take a look at it for me. And he agreed without hesitation, telling me to bring it by when I could. And I thanked him, ending the call with a sense of quiet resolve. Because this was no longer just a suspicion, it was something I was actively uncovering, step by step. And when I went back inside, Lily was sitting by the window, drawing quietly, and I walked over and sat beside her, not asking questions, not pressing her for more, but simply being there, letting her know she was not alone in this. And after a few moments, she shifted slightly closer to me, her small hand brushing against mine. And that simple gesture carried more meaning than words ever could. And I placed my hand gently over hers again, steady, reassuring. And in that moment, I understood that whatever was happening here, whatever truth was unfolding, I was no longer facing it alone. And as the afternoon light shifted across the room, I made one more quiet decision, one that felt just as important as all the others, that I would not only uncover what had been hidden from me, I would do it carefully enough that when the truth finally came to light, there would be no denying it, not for them, not for anyone. The next morning, I left the house earlier than usual, telling Olivia that I wanted to get some fresh air and perhaps stop by a small cafe nearby. Something simple, something that would not raise suspicion, and she smiled as she always did, offering to drive me or to come along. But I declined gently, insisting that I wanted the walk, that it would be good for me. And she hesitated for just a fraction of a second before agreeing. And that hesitation did not go unnoticed, because it told me that my movements were expected to stay within a certain pattern, and anything outside of that pattern required adjustment on her part. And I kept my pace slow as I walked down the sidewalk, the morning air cool against my face, my steps steady, my mind focused, because this was the first time in months that I was leaving the house alone, without anyone monitoring where I was going or how long I would be gone. And that realization carried both a sense of freedom and a quiet urgency. And when I reached my car, I paused for a moment, resting my hand on the door, reminding myself to remain calm, to move through this the same way I had approached everything else, with patience and intention. And then I got in and drove across town to the pharmacy I had called the day before, the familiar storefront bringing back memories of a time when my life had felt simpler, when trust had not required verification. And as I stepped inside, the soft chime of the door echoed behind me, and I was greeted by the pharmacist, Mr. Harris, who recognized me almost immediately despite the years that had passed, and his expression softened with concern when I explained that I needed him to take a look at my medication, and I handed him the bottle carefully, watching as he examined it, his brow furrowing slightly as he read the label, turning it over in his hands, comparing the pills inside to something in his memory. And he asked me a few quiet questions, how long I had been taking them, whether I had noticed any changes in how I felt, and I answered him honestly, explaining the fatigue, the confusion, the way my thoughts had felt just out of reach. And he listened without interrupting, his focus sharpening with each word. And then he stepped away for a moment, disappearing into the back room with the bottle still in his hand, leaving me standing there in the quiet space of the pharmacy, my heart steady but alert, because I understood that whatever he was about to confirm would change everything in a way I could not take back. And when he returned, his expression was no longer neutral. There was a seriousness there, a weight that settled between us before he even spoke. And he explained carefully that the medication in the bottle did not match what was listed on the label, that while it appeared similar at a glance, it contained a compound that could cause drowsiness, confusion, and gradual cognitive impairment if taken consistently over time. and he emphasized that it was not something that would cause immediate harm, but rather something that would alter a person's clarity, their independence, their ability to function without assistance. And I listened to him without reacting outwardly, absorbing every word, every implication, because this was the confirmation I had needed, the final piece that transformed suspicion into certainty. And I thanked him calmly, asking if he could document his findings in writing, something official, something that could not be dismissed as misunderstanding, and he agreed, printing out a report and signing it before handing it to me. And I folded it carefully, placing it in my purse as if it were just another receipt. But in truth it felt like something far more significant, something that represented not just evidence, but clarity. And as I walked back to my car, the world around me looked the same as it always had. People moving through their routines, cars passing by, the ordinary rhythm of a day unfolding without interruption. And yet for me, everything had shifted, because now I knew, without doubt, that what had been happening in my own home had not been accidental. It had not been miscommunication or overprotection. It had been deliberate, controlled, designed to make me dependent, to make me question myself, to make others question me. And as I sat behind the wheel, I allowed myself one deep breath, not of fear, but of recognition, because this was no longer about wondering what was wrong. This was about deciding what I was going to do next. And when I returned home, I carried myself the same way I always did, moving through the front door with a quiet greeting, setting my purse down, asking Lily about her day, maintaining the rhythm that had been established long before I began to see through it. And Olivia greeted me with that same careful attention, asking where I had gone, whether I had enjoyed my walk. And I answered her simply, telling her I had stopped by a cafe and taken my time. Nothing more, nothing that would give her reason to question. And she nodded, satisfied, and turned back to what she was doing. But I noticed the way her eyes lingered on me just a moment longer than usual, as if she were assessing something she could not quite define. And I met that look with the same calm expression I had worn all day, giving her nothing to read, nothing to suspect, because I understood now that the balance between what they believed and what I knew was my greatest advantage. And as the evening approached and the familiar routine began again, the dinner, the conversation, the placement of the pills beside my plate, I followed the same pattern, lifting the glass, pretending to swallow, maintaining the illusion that everything was exactly as it had been. But inside, there was no confusion, no hesitation, only a clear, steady awareness of what had been done and what would come next. And when I glanced across the table at Lily, I saw that same quiet understanding reflected back at me. And for the first time since this all began, I felt something stronger than unease, stronger than suspicion. I felt prepared, because now I was no longer searching for the truth. I was holding it. And the only question left was how and when I would choose to reveal it. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I did not turn off the lamp beside me right away. Instead, I sat there quietly with the report from Mr. Harris folded neatly in my hands, reading it again and again, not because I did not understand it the first time, but because I wanted every word to settle into me with complete clarity, every detail, every confirmation, so that there would be no doubt left, no space for second guessing. And as I read the lines describing the compound, the effects it could have over time, the way it could alter memory, slow thinking, create dependency, I felt something inside me shift into a calm, steady resolve, because what had once been confusion was now a pattern, and what had once been a pattern was now proof. And I placed the paper carefully back into my purse, closing it with deliberate precision, as if sealing something important inside. And then I reached for the pill bottle on my nightstand, holding it in my hand, turning it slowly as I studied it. Once more, the label clean and professional, the instructions clear, everything about it designed to inspire trust. And yet now I knew that what mattered was not what it said, but what it contained. And I set it down again, my movements quiet, controlled, because I understood that from this moment forward, every action I took had to serve a purpose, not just for myself, but for what I intended to uncover next. And the next morning, I began that process, not by changing anything dramatically, but by paying closer attention than ever before, watching the way Olivia handled the medications, the way she organized them, the specific time she insisted they be taken, and I noticed that she rarely allowed anyone else near them. that she maintained a quiet control over that part of the routine, and when I asked casually if I could manage them myself, just to feel a little more independent, she responded quickly, almost too quickly, insisting that it was easier if she handled everything, that it was better for me, and I nodded, accepting her explanation without argument, because I was not trying to challenge her, not yet. I was gathering, observing, allowing her to continue exactly as she had been, because consistency was what would reveal everything. And over the next few days, I continued this pattern, taking nothing, pretending everything, watching everything, and I began to notice more than just the medication. I noticed the way Olivia spoke about me to others on the phone, her voice soft but carrying a tone of concern that painted a picture of someone fragile, someone in need of constant care, someone who could not be trusted to manage her own affairs. And I realized then that this was not just about control within the home. It extended beyond it, shaping how others saw me, how decisions might be made about me without my involvement. And that realization added another layer to what I was uncovering, because it meant that whatever she was doing had a purpose that reached further than I had initially thought. And that purpose became clearer one afternoon when I overheard a conversation she thought I was not paying attention to. Her voice lowered as she spoke on the phone, mentioning paperwork, mentioning evaluations, mentioning the possibility of additional support if my condition continued to decline. And though she did not say it directly, the implication was clear enough that she was building a case, slowly, carefully, one that would position her as the responsible one, the caretaker, the decision-maker, and me as someone who needed that control. And I sat there quietly, pretending to focus on the television while every word settled into place, because now I could see the direction this was going, not just dependence, but authority, not just influence, but ownership over decisions that should have remained mine. And that was when I understood that what I needed next was not just evidence of the medication, but evidence of intent, of pattern, of design, something that would connect all of this in a way that could not be dismissed or explained away. And I began to think carefully about how to gather that, not in a way that would alert her, but in a way that would allow everything to unfold naturally. And that evening, as we sat down for dinner, I watched her once again place the pills beside my plate, her movements smooth, practiced, and I followed the same routine, lifting the glass, pretending, maintaining the image she expected. And when I set it down, I looked at her for just a moment longer than usual, not enough to raise suspicion, but enough to observe her reaction. And there it was, that subtle shift, that quiet satisfaction, as if she had just confirmed something important. And I held on to that, because it told me that this routine was not just habit, it was part of something she was tracking, something she was relying on. And later that night, when the house grew quiet again, I moved carefully through the hallway, not making noise, not drawing attention, and I paused outside the kitchen, listening, because I had begun to notice that Olivia often returned there after everyone else had gone to bed. And sure enough, I heard the soft sound of cabinets opening, the faint clink of glass, and I remained still, watching from the edge of the doorway as she stood by the counter, her back to me, her hands moving with deliberate care as she handled the bottles. And I did not step forward, I did not interrupt, I simply observed, committing every movement to memory, because this was no longer about suspicion, it was about confirmation. And as I returned quietly to my room, closing the door behind me with the same careful control I had used in everything else, I understood that I was getting closer, closer to seeing the full picture, closer to understanding not just what had been done, but why. And that understanding would be what determined how this would end. The following day, I did not change my routine, not in any visible way, because by now I understood that the greatest advantage I had was their belief that nothing had changed at all. And I moved through the morning as I always did, slow, measured, predictable, allowing Olivia to remain comfortable in the illusion she had carefully built. And as she prepared breakfast and set the pills beside my plate, I followed the same pattern, lifting the glass, pretending to swallow, maintaining the rhythm she expected. And when she turned away, satisfied, I let my hand rest lightly on the table for a moment longer than necessary, grounding myself in the awareness that every second of this performance mattered, because I was no longer simply observing, I was preparing. And after they left for the day, I did not wait. I moved directly to the kitchen, not hurried, but purposeful, and I opened the cabinet once more, taking out the bottles exactly as I had seen her handle them the night before, paying attention to the order, the placement, the small details that might reveal something I had not yet noticed, and this time I did not just compare them. I took my phone and quietly photographed each label, each pill, documenting everything with a precision I had not needed before, because now I understood that memory alone was not enough. I needed something concrete, something that could not be dismissed, and as I worked, I kept my movements controlled, replacing each item exactly as I had found it, ensuring that nothing would appear disturbed. Because the last thing I wanted was to alert her to the fact that I was no longer the passive presence she believed me to be, and when I finished, I stepped back and looked at the cabinet one more time, committing its arrangement to memory before closing it gently, and the rest of the morning I spent reviewing what I had gathered, comparing the images to the report from Mr. Harris, noting the discrepancies, the inconsistencies that confirmed what I already knew. And yet even with that confirmation, I did not feel anger in the way I might have expected. Instead, there was a calm, steady clarity, because this was no longer about emotion, it was about understanding, about seeing the full shape of what had been done. And as the hours passed, I began to notice something else, something that had been present all along but had only now come into focus. The way Olivia managed not just the medication, but the narrative around me. The way she spoke to neighbors, to friends, even to Daniel, always framing my condition in a way that emphasized decline, that justified her involvement, that positioned her as necessary. And I realized that this was not a series of isolated actions. It was a system, carefully maintained, reinforced through repetition, and that realization led me to a question I had not yet fully considered. How long had this been happening? And how far had it already progressed beyond what I could see? And that question stayed with me through the afternoon, through the quiet moments with Lily, through the ordinary tasks that filled the day, and when Daniel and Olivia returned that evening, I watched them more closely than ever before, not just their actions, but their interactions, the way they communicated, the subtle cues that passed between them. And I began to see that Daniel's role in all of this was not as simple as I had first thought. Because while Olivia controlled the details, Daniel provided something just as important: silence, acceptance, a willingness not to question what was being done, and that silence, I realized, was what allowed everything else to continue. And as we sat down for dinner, the routine repeated itself once more: the placement of the pills, the careful observation, the quiet satisfaction when I pretended to take them. And I met Olivia's gaze for just a moment, long enough to see that same subtle shift in her expression, that same confirmation that her plan was proceeding exactly as intended. And I held that moment, storing it away, because each of these small reactions was part of the larger picture I was building. And later that night, when the house had settled into silence again, I did not go to bed right away. Instead, I remained in the living room, sitting quietly with the lights dimmed, waiting, not out of uncertainty, but out of intention, because I had begun to recognize a pattern in Olivia's movements, a time when she believed no one was watching. And sure enough, after some time had passed, I heard the soft creak of the floorboards, the faint movement from the kitchen, and I remained still, allowing the quiet to conceal me as I observed from a distance, watching as she moved through the same routine I had seen before, opening the cabinet, handling the bottles, making adjustments that were small but deliberate. And this time I paid even closer attention, noting not just what she did, but how she did it, the care, the consistency, the absence of hesitation, and it became clear to me that this was not something she questioned, not something she struggled with. It was something she believed in, something she had committed to fully, and that realization settled into me with a weight that was not surprising, but significant, because it confirmed that what I was dealing with was not temporary, not accidental, but intentional and ongoing. And as I quietly returned to my room, closing the door behind me with the same careful control, I understood that I had reached a point where observation alone was no longer enough. I had gathered evidence. I had confirmed patterns. I had seen the system for what it was. And now the question was not whether I understood what was happening, but how I would choose to respond to it. And that decision, I knew, would require just as much care and precision as everything that had come before. That night, I did not wait for certainty to come to me any further, because I already had enough of it. Instead, I began to think in terms of structure, of steps, of how to move forward without breaking the illusion that had allowed me to see so much already. And as I sat quietly in my room with the lamp casting a soft circle of light across the bed, I took out the report from Mr. Harris again, along with the photographs I had taken on my phone, placing everything side by side, not out of confusion, but out of intention, because I needed to organize what I knew into something that could not be questioned, something that would hold its weight even if someone tried to dismiss it. And I realized that what I had gathered so far was not just information, it was leverage, and the way I used it would determine everything that came next. And I leaned back slightly, letting that thought settle, because I understood now that reacting emotionally would only weaken my position. What I needed was patience, timing, and precision, the same qualities Olivia had used, but for a very different purpose. And as I turned off the lamp and lay down, I did not feel restless the way I had in the days before. Instead, there was a quiet sense of control, as if I had stepped into a role I had not realized I was capable of playing. And the next morning, I began to put that into motion, not by confronting anyone, not by changing the routine in any obvious way, but by introducing something small, something that would allow me to observe how Olivia responded when the pattern shifted. And during breakfast, when she placed the pills beside my plate as always, I looked at them for a moment longer than usual before picking them up, and instead of immediately pretending to take them, I asked a simple question, my tone calm, almost casual, asking if the dosage had been adjusted recently because I had been feeling clearer than usual, and I watched her carefully as I spoke, because this was not just a question, it was a test, and for a brief moment, something flickered in her expression, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough for me to see that she had not expected that line of thought, and she recovered quickly, of course, explaining that sometimes the body responds differently over time, that it was normal to have variations, and I nodded, accepting her explanation without resistance, lifting the glass and completing the familiar motion, maintaining the illusion, but inside I had confirmed something important, that even a small deviation in my behavior required her to adjust, and that meant her control depended on consistency, and that was something I could use. And after they left for the day, I did not go to the cabinet right away. Instead, I sat in the living room with Lily, watching her draw, allowing the quiet between us to remain undisturbed, because I had learned that she would speak when she felt safe, not when she was asked. And after some time, she shifted slightly closer to me, her small voice barely above a whisper as she said, "She checks if you swallow." And I felt a calm settle over me as I nodded, because that aligned perfectly with what I had already begun to suspect, that this was not just about giving the pills, it was about confirming they were taken, and that meant the process was monitored, and if it was monitored, then it could also be observed, documented, and eventually exposed. And I placed my hand gently over hers, reassuring her without words, because I did not need her to say more than she was ready to. I only needed to understand enough to move forward carefully, and that afternoon, I made another small adjustment, one that would not be immediately noticeable, but would allow me to gather something more concrete. I placed my phone in the kitchen in a position that appeared casual, almost forgotten, but angled in a way that captured the cabinet area clearly, and I left it there, not checking it, not drawing attention to it, simply allowing it to remain part of the environment. And when Olivia returned home later that day, I greeted her the same way I always did, calm, steady, giving her nothing to question, and the evening unfolded as it always had. Dinner, conversation, the placement of the pills, the careful observation, and I followed the routine once more, pretending, maintaining the pattern, because I understood now that every repetition was an opportunity. And later that night, when the house settled into silence and I heard the familiar movement from the kitchen, I remained in my room this time, not stepping out, not watching directly, because I did not need to. I had already set the stage for something else to capture what I needed, and I lay there quietly, listening to the faint sounds of cabinets opening and closing, the soft clink of glass, the rhythm of a routine that had become second nature to her, and I allowed that moment to pass, without interruption, because patience was what had brought me this far, and it would carry me further still. And when the house grew quiet again, I did not rush to retrieve the phone. I waited until morning, until everything appeared normal once more, and only then, when I was alone, did I pick it up and sit down, my fingers steady as I opened the recording, watching carefully as the scene unfolded, the kitchen, the cabinet. Olivia moving into frame exactly as I had expected, her actions clear, deliberate, unguarded in the way people are when they believe no one is watching. And as I watched her handle the bottles, making the same precise adjustments I had seen before, I felt no shock, no surprise, only confirmation, because now I did not just know what was happening, I could show it. And that changed everything, because evidence transforms truth into something undeniable. And as I set the phone down, I understood that I had reached a new point in this process, one where observation had turned into preparation, and preparation was about to turn into action, and the only thing left now was deciding exactly when to let everything come into the light. By the time I finished watching the recording, I did not feel shaken, I felt aligned, as if every piece that had been scattered across the past few weeks had finally settled into a single, clear picture, and I sat there for a long moment with the phone still in my hand, not replaying the video again, because I did not need to. I had already seen enough. Instead, I focused on what came next, because understanding what had been done was only one part of this. The more important part was deciding how to respond in a way that would not only protect me, but expose everything in a way that could not be denied, and I knew that required more than just one piece of evidence. It required context, timing, and the right moment. And as I placed the phone down beside me, I took out the report from Mr. Harris once more, laying it next to the device, looking at both side by side. And I realized that what I had now was not just proof of altered medication, but proof of intent, of repeated action, of something that had been carried out with consistency and care, and that realization brought with it a sense of control I had not felt in a very long time. Because now I was no longer reacting to what was happening, I was shaping what would happen next, and that morning, when Olivia placed the pills beside my plate as she always did, I followed the same routine, the same calm expression, the same measured movements, because the illusion needed to remain intact just a little longer, and I noticed that she was watching me more closely than before, not in an obvious way, but with a quiet attentiveness that suggested she was beginning to sense something she could not quite identify, and I allowed that to exist without addressing it, because uncertainty on her part would only make her more careful, and careful behavior often reveals more than confidence does. And after they left for the day, I began to take the next step, not in the house, but beyond it, because what I needed now was support, not emotional support, but professional, objective, something that would stand independently of my word. And I made a call to an attorney I had worked with years ago, someone who had helped my husband and me with our estate planning, someone who understood both the legal and personal weight of family matters. And when he answered, I kept my voice steady, explaining that I needed to review some documents and discuss a situation that required discretion, and he agreed to meet with me that afternoon. And as I prepared to leave the house, I made sure everything appeared as it always had, my movements slow, my demeanor calm, giving no indication that anything had changed. And when I arrived at his office, I placed the report, the photographs, and the recording in front of him, explaining each piece without exaggeration, without emotion, simply stating what I had observed and what had been confirmed. And he listened carefully, his expression serious but composed, asking precise questions, clarifying details. And when I finished, he leaned back slightly, considering everything before speaking, and he told me that what I had brought to him was significant, not just in terms of personal concern, but in terms of potential legal implications, because altering medication, misrepresenting a person's mental state, and attempting to establish control over their decisions could lead to actions that affected financial authority, medical authority, and more. And he advised me not to confront anyone yet, not until we had secured additional safeguards. And that aligned perfectly with what I had already begun to understand. And together we discussed the next steps, reviewing my current documents, identifying areas that needed to be reinforced, and putting measures in place to ensure that no one could make decisions on my behalf without clear, verified consent. And as I left his office, I felt something settle into place that went beyond awareness, beyond preparation. It was a sense of protection, of structure, of knowing that I was no longer vulnerable in the way I had been before. And when I returned home that evening, everything appeared exactly as it always did. Olivia in the kitchen, Daniel in the living room, Lily quietly at the table, and I moved through the space with the same calm presence I had maintained all along, because now I understood that the final step would not be rushed. It would come at the right moment, when everything was aligned, when every piece was in place. And as dinner was served and the familiar routine repeated itself once more, I followed it, lifting the glass, maintaining the illusion, allowing them to believe that their plan was still unfolding exactly as intended. And when I glanced at Lily, I saw that same quiet awareness in her eyes, the same understanding that something was changing, even if she did not yet know how or when. And later that night, as I sat alone in my room, I looked once more at everything I had gathered, not to question it, but to confirm that it was complete, and I realized that I was no longer waiting to understand what was happening. I was waiting for the moment to reveal it, and that moment, I knew, was closer than they could possibly imagine. The moment I chose did not arrive with noise or urgency. It arrived quietly, the same way everything else in this house had unfolded. And that was exactly why it worked, because by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late to change it. And I planned it carefully, not around confrontation, but around certainty, around placing every piece exactly where it needed to be so that the truth would not just be spoken, it would be seen, understood, and impossible to deny. And that evening, I invited Daniel and Olivia to sit down after dinner, my tone calm, almost casual, telling them I wanted to go over a few things about my health and future plans, something that sounded ordinary enough not to raise alarm. And they agreed without hesitation, because from their perspective, I was still the same woman who relied on them, who trusted them, who did not question, and we sat together in the living room, Lily quietly nearby with her book, her presence small but steady. And I began slowly, speaking about how I had been feeling better lately, clearer, more aware, and I watched as Olivia's expression tightened just slightly, that subtle shift I had come to recognize so well. And Daniel glanced at her before looking back at me, uncertain but silent, and I continued, explaining that I had decided to review my medications, to understand them more fully, and I saw Olivia's posture change, her body becoming more attentive, more controlled, and she began to respond, gently at first, reminding me that everything had been handled for my benefit, that there was no need to worry, and I nodded, acknowledging her words without agreeing, because this was not about argument, it was about sequence, and I reached for my purse, placing it on the table between us, opening it slowly, deliberately, and I took out the report from Mr. Harris, setting it down in front of them without a word, allowing the silence to hold for just a moment longer than comfortable. And then I spoke, my voice steady, explaining that I had taken my medication to be reviewed independently, that I had wanted to be certain of what I was taking, and I watched as Olivia's eyes moved to the paper, her expression carefully neutral, but I could see the tension beneath it, the calculation, the rapid assessment of what this meant. And Daniel leaned forward slightly, reading the document with a growing confusion that shifted into something more serious as he reached the part describing the contents of the pills. And he looked up at me, then at Olivia, his silence no longer neutral but questioning. And I let that moment settle before I continued, because I understood that this was not just about presenting evidence. It was about allowing them to process it in real time, without interruption, without escape. And then I took out my phone, placing it beside the report, and I said simply that I had also observed certain patterns, that I had documented them. And I pressed play, letting the recording fill the quiet room. The image of the kitchen appearing on the screen, Olivia moving through the space exactly as she had when she believed no one was watching, her actions clear, deliberate, unmistakable. And I did not speak while it played, I did not explain, I did not accuse. I allowed the reality of it to stand on its own, and when the video ended, the silence that followed was different from before, heavier, undeniable, and Daniel's expression had changed completely. The confusion replaced by something sharper, something that could no longer be ignored. And he turned to Olivia, his voice low but firm, asking her to explain, and she did not respond immediately, because for the first time, she did not have control of the narrative, and I watched her carefully, noting the shift in her composure, the way she searched for a response that would restore the balance she had maintained for so long. And I did not interrupt, I did not push, because this was not a moment I needed to control. It was one I had already set in motion, and finally, she spoke, her tone measured, attempting to frame what had happened as concern, as a way to help, to manage, to ensure stability. But her words lacked the certainty they once had, because now they existed alongside evidence that contradicted them, and I listened without reacting, allowing her explanation to unfold fully, because I understood that every word she chose now would matter, not just in this room, but beyond it. And when she finished, I simply nodded, acknowledging that I had heard her, and then I spoke again, not with anger, not with accusation, but with clarity, explaining that I had already taken steps to protect myself, that my legal and medical decisions were now secured, that no one could act on my behalf without my direct consent, and I watched as that realization settled over them. Because this was the part they had not anticipated, not just that I would understand what had been happening, but that I would act on it with precision, and I stood slowly, my movement steady, my voice calm as I added one final thing, that from this point forward, everything would be handled differently, and I did not need to say more than that, because the room itself held the rest, the evidence, the silence, the shift that could not be undone, and as I turned to leave, I glanced briefly at Lily, and in that moment, I saw something in her expression that had not been there before, not fear, not silence, but something closer to relief, and I understood then that this was not just the end of something, it was the beginning of something else entirely. After I left the room that night, I did not look back, not because I was afraid of what I might see, but because I already knew that whatever expressions were on their faces no longer held any power over me. And as I walked down the hallway toward my room, my steps felt steadier than they had in months, not just physically, but in a way that reached deeper than that, as if I had reclaimed something that had been slowly taken from me without my realizing it. And when I closed the door behind me, I did not sit down immediately. Instead, I stood there for a moment, letting the quiet settle around me, because for the first time since all of this began, the silence in the house no longer felt controlled by someone else. It felt neutral, open, and that difference mattered more than anything I could have said out loud. And I moved to the window, looking out at the dark street, the faint glow of the streetlights stretching across the pavement, and I allowed myself a single deep breath, not out of relief, but out of recognition, because what had just happened was not the end of the situation. It was the shift that made everything else possible. And the next morning, the house felt different, not in any dramatic way, but in the small, subtle changes that only become visible when you know what to look for. Olivia was quieter, more measured in her movements, her usual ease replaced with a careful restraint, as if she were recalculating every step. And Daniel, for the first time in a long while, did not avoid looking at me. Instead, there was something unsettled in his expression, something that suggested he was beginning to question not just what had been done, but how long it had been happening, and I did not address any of it directly. I moved through the morning with the same calm presence I had maintained, because I understood that the most powerful position I could hold now was one of control, not through force, but through certainty. And when Olivia placed the pills beside my plate out of habit, her hand paused for just a fraction of a second before pulling back, and neither of us acknowledged it, but the meaning was clear. That routine no longer belonged to her, and I did not touch them, not even to pretend. I simply continued with my breakfast, allowing the absence of that action to speak for itself, and no one said a word, not Olivia, not Daniel. And that silence carried more weight than any confrontation could have, because it marked the end of something that had once been unquestioned. And after breakfast, Daniel approached me in the living room, his voice quieter than usual, asking if we could talk. And I nodded, gesturing for him to sit. And for a moment he struggled to find the words, his usual confidence replaced with hesitation. And when he finally spoke, he asked how long I had known, not accusing, not defensive, but searching, and I answered him honestly, explaining that I had begun to notice changes, that I had chosen to understand before reacting, and that I had given him and Olivia the opportunity to continue exactly as they had been so that I could see the full picture. And he listened, his expression shifting as he processed that. And there was something in that moment that I recognized, not just confusion, but realization, the kind that does not come all at once, but in pieces that slowly connect. And I did not press him further, because I knew that whatever he needed to understand, he would have to reach on his own. And as the day went on, Olivia kept her distance, her interactions polite but limited, her usual presence in every detail noticeably reduced, and that told me more than any explanation could have, because it meant she understood the position she was now in, and that understanding would shape everything she did next. And later that afternoon, I made another call to my attorney, updating him on what had taken place, and he confirmed that the measures we had put in place were secure, that any attempt to alter my situation without my consent would be challenged immediately, and that gave me a level of reassurance that extended beyond the house itself, because this was no longer contained within these walls. It was documented, supported, protected, and when I ended the call, I looked across the room at Lily, who was sitting quietly with her book, and I noticed something different in her posture, something lighter, as if the tension she had been carrying was beginning to ease, and I walked over and sat beside her, not saying anything at first, just allowing the quiet to remain comfortable. And after a moment, she leaned slightly closer, her small hand resting against mine without hesitation, and that simple gesture carried a sense of trust that I understood had not come easily, and I placed my hand gently over hers, steady, reassuring, because in many ways, she had been the one to start all of this, the one who had broken through the silence when it mattered most. And as the evening approached, the house settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that no longer revolved around control or pretense, but around something quieter, more uncertain, and I moved through it with the same calm clarity I had held on to, because I knew that while the truth had been revealed, what came next would require just as much care as everything that had come before. And as I prepared for the night, I understood that the power in this situation no longer came from what had been hidden, but from what had been brought into the light, and that was something no one could take from me again. In the days that followed, nothing returned to the way it had been before, but not in a way that felt chaotic or unstable. Instead, there was a quiet reordering of everything, as if the truth, once brought into the open, had gently but firmly shifted the structure of the house itself. And I moved through those days with the same steady clarity I had found within myself, not rushing decisions, not forcing outcomes, but allowing each step to unfold with intention. And Olivia kept her distance, her presence no longer woven into every detail of my routine, her movements careful, measured, as if she were navigating a space that no longer belonged to her in the way it once had. And Daniel changed as well, not all at once, but in small ways that revealed a growing awareness. He asked more questions, he listened more closely, and for the first time in a long time, there was something genuine in his attention, something that had been absent before, and I did not demand explanations from him. I did not push him to choose sides or assign blame, because I understood that his understanding would come in its own time, and what mattered now was not what had been done, but what would be done moving forward. And one morning, as I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, I looked around the room and realized that I no longer felt like a guest in my own life. The subtle sense of being managed, of being observed, of being quietly guided without my consent, had lifted, and in its place was something far more grounded, a sense of ownership, of presence, of knowing that the decisions being made were mine again. And that realization did not come with a surge of emotion. It came with a calm that settled deeply and remained. And later that day, I met once more with my attorney, finalizing the updates we had discussed, ensuring that my medical and financial decisions were clearly defined, that no one could act on my behalf without explicit authorization, and that everything was documented in a way that left no room for interpretation. And as I signed those papers, I did so without hesitation, not because I had lost trust entirely, but because I had learned that trust, when given without awareness, could be reshaped into something else entirely. And when I returned home, I found Lily in the living room, sitting quietly with her drawing. And when she looked up at me, there was something in her expression that had changed as well, not just relief, but a kind of openness, as if the weight she had been carrying had begun to lift. And I sat beside her, not asking anything of her, not expecting her to speak, but simply being present. And after a moment, she leaned slightly toward me, her voice still soft, but no longer hidden, as she said, "You are okay now." And I nodded gently, placing my hand over hers, because in that simple statement, there was a truth that did not need to be expanded upon. And in the weeks that followed, Lily spoke more often, not all at once, not in long conversations, but in small, steady steps. each word a quiet reclaiming of something that had been taken from her, and I made sure that she knew she was safe, not just through words, but through consistency, through presence, through the absence of fear that had once shaped her silence. And as for Olivia, she remained in the house for a time, her role shifting, her control gone, her actions no longer hidden behind routine, and eventually, she chose to leave, not in anger, not in confrontation, but in the quiet understanding that the position she had held no longer existed. And Daniel faced that change in his own way, with difficulty, with reflection, with a growing awareness of the choices he had allowed to unfold without question, and I did not interfere in that process, because it was his to navigate, just as mine had been. And over time, the house settled into a new rhythm, one that felt balanced, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was clear. And as I stood one evening by the window, watching the light fade from the sky, I thought back to that moment when Lily had first spoken, that quiet warning that had changed everything. And I understood then that what had saved me was not just the words themselves, but what they had allowed me to see, the truth that had been there all along, waiting for me to recognize it. And as I turned away from the window, moving through a space that once again felt like my own, I carried that understanding with me, not as something heavy, but as something steady, something that would remain, because I had learned that silence can hide many things, but it can also break when it matters most, and when it does, it has the power to change everything.